The European Union published its Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade Action Plan in 2003. The plan sets out a range of measures available to the EU and its member states to tackle illegal logging around the world. Guyana has been moving towards getting fully on board and will soon enter into a Voluntary Partnership Agreement, or VPA, with the EU. A number of agencies are working towards this objective.
At a governance overarching national level, EU FLEGT is the governance arm for the forestry sector. It's internationally recognized. Several tropical countries around the world are moving towards ratifying or coming on board with EU FLEGT. I am confident that Guyana may be one of the first countries to issue a FLEGT license.
The role of the AG chambers here is to provide the technical advice and assistance in the drafting of the legal documents. What one needs to remember is that the entire agreement is really a legal document. So what we do is we take the advice and recommendations from the consultations and from the NTWG and try to craft it so that the agreement reflects the views and the position of the NTWG stakeholders, the state, everybody.
The Guyana Revenue Authority, we perform several agency functions, and this is no different from any other agency function that we will be performing. As it relates to the EU Flight Secretariat and the Guyana Revenue Authority being the main agency responsible for all exports leaving our shores, we are required to ensure that the certificate is issued and that the product is fit for exportation.
In this episode, you will learn more about the VPA Annexes, particularly product scope and the legality definition and regulatory framework.
The annexes describe the practical steps for implementing the core commitments in the VPA in detail. Annexes provide country-specific information such as the laws the partner country will monitor under the VPA, the products the agreement will cover, the technical systems for verifying legality, tracing timber and issuing FLEGT licenses in the partner country, the government departments and agencies involved in implementing the VPA and their roles, and the information and documentation that will be put in the public domain and the mechanisms through which this will happen.
The annexes of the VPA are essentially the chapters that make up the agreement. And so I usually give an analogy of a book, and if you think of a book and the various chapters in that book, then you think of the annexes in pretty much the same way. But like a book, every annex or every chapter deals with something very, very specific. And so what you have for the VPA, there are 11 annexes in the VPA, and each of those annexes deals with a specific area that Guyana has to come up with a number of things that we are in agreement with. And then that will essentially, when put together, will form what we will then refer to as the VPA agreement or the VPA document. Essentially, the annexes, once completed, because most of them are still in a draft form, but once completed, will then be, and there's consensus at the national level, then they will simply be put together and form the VPA agreement.
Annex 1 focuses on the products to be covered under the VPA.
Because the VPA is a trade agreement, and so what the product scope really is dealing with is what the products that this trade agreement will cover. And so not everything that, all timber and timber products can be covered under the agreement, and there are a number of reasons why that cannot happen at this point in time. However, there has been agreement on at least 6 products or 6 groups of products that can be covered under this agreement at this present time. I think it's important to mention that as the agreement, over time, let's say if we revisit the agreement in 5 years, for example, we are also then going to have an opportunity to look at whether or not we want to expand this product scope to bring other things under the agreement, and of course it will be influenced by stakeholders, the market forces, and so on. But essentially, the 6 products that are currently covered under the product scope are there's roundwood, which will then cover your logs, your piles, your poles, and so on that Guyana does export. You will have your sawnwood, which would cover all your lumber. So all the wood that has been cut in some, has a length, a breadth, thickness. All your dressed lumber is going to be covered under that group of products. So sawnwood, and then you have sleepers, which is a particular product that is used primarily for making the tracks, the wood that is used for the tracks of trains to run on. And so that is also going to be covered under this agreement. You have plywood, you have veneer, which is the sheets that you form the plywood from, and then you have a product that is known as parquet, which is more or less wooden flooring, which is also one of the products that will be covered under this agreement in its current form. As I said, it's important to note that this list of products is not set in stone in that sense, because I think from time to time we hear from stakeholders that what if we want to add, and they may come up with a product. Say, well, and furniture has been one that has been discussed quite a lot recently, and even over the course of this discussions under the VPA. Furniture, for example, is one of the things we have commenced work in terms of consulting with stakeholders to say, listen, yes, we are looking to sign this agreement without furniture at this moment in time. However, as a country, we are very interested in, by the next review period, which may be 5 years, we would very much like to add furniture to that scope. And so, stakeholders should not think that because the list is there, that in the future this list cannot be adjusted or changed.
Many of the products on our product scope is also what is being exported by many other tropical countries. So we try to capture as much of the timber products that we export to include on the list.
While an initial 6 products are listed under the VPA, others can still be exported to the EU from Guyana.
There is some discussion about including furniture. Again, this inclusion will be made after consultations, after meeting with the furniture manufacturers. We want to make sure and ensure that everyone is up to speed and is able to comply with the necessary requirements. So after further consultations, we will explore the possibility of including furniture on our product scope.
Though the 6 will be covered under the VPA, there is nothing preventing other products from going to the EU. And so the EU, I think, upon recognition that this could have been a situation that could have happened, there is what we refer to as the EU timber regulations. And what that allows for is that stakeholders that are desirous of sending other products that the agreement may not cover at this point in time can still, under that regulation, have their products enter the EU. The significant difference with that and the VPA would be that there is far more extensive checks that will have to be done, because there's a due diligence system that will have to be set up. So if you are desirous of, let's say, shipping furniture, yourself and the buyer in the EU is going to have to work out a number of checks that have to be done at your end to say that the product that you're producing is legal and can enter the EU. Under the VPA, once that 6 products has been approved under the VPA, then shipping becomes, it's like if you have a red lane and a green lane, we essentially have a green lane for those 6 products that have been covered under the agreement. And so export to the EU becomes quite simple.
The action plan sets out measures to prevent the imports of illegal timber into the EU, improve the supply of legal timber, and increase demand for timber from responsibly managed forests.
what happens when the VPA becomes operational is that there are a number of checks and balances that will be done in country. And so we'll set up a system that will say these are the checks and balances that are in place in country. That is then agreed with the EU, and so Guyana and the EU then sit together and look at the system that has been set up and say yes, when the EU, when both parties, as you say, are satisfied that what you have at the end is a product that is verified legal. So in country, you will still be required, and most of our stakeholders will be familiar with this, is your tagging. You have to get your operational plans, your tagging, your permits, royalties have to be paid. All of that is still going to remain. However, when it comes to export, there's not going to be somebody in Europe, for example, who's going to be asking you for a number of additional documentation. So in country, the process is still what I think the stakeholders are very familiar with. So you're still cutting, you're still using your permits, you're still tagging, you're still paying the royalties, all the procedures and steps that have been in place. But once a FLEGT license has been issued to you, you are then simply presenting that to the EU authorities, and that then gives you access to the EU. Whereas under the EUTR, even though you are still following all the steps in country, when you get to the EU, because the product may not be covered by the VPA, you still have to now yourself as the supplier and the buyer in the EU is still going to have to go through what they refer to as a due diligence checklist that still outlines a number of additional things that will have to be done. And it is sometimes it can be quite tedious, quite a lot of requirements on the placed on the stakeholder if he wants to enter the EU.
A FLEGT license for an exporter will guarantee that the timber from Guyana has been harvested, processed, and exported in accordance with national laws.
So currently what happens is when a consignment or a ship, somebody desires of sending, let's say, a container of timber to the EU, or anywhere for that matter, a number of documents are prepared and brought into the Forestry Commission. That is then processed. At the end of that process, what we currently have in place is what we refer to as the export certificate. Now that is a piece of document that is enshrined in Guyana's law. So under our current legal systems, every timber that has to be exported must be covered by an export certificate. However, what will be additional to going to the EU is that you will now have to get a FLEGT license. And that FLEGT license will only be issued for timber and timber products, or those 6 products that I've mentioned that are going to the EU. But I think it's important to note that when persons think of a FLEGT license, they sometimes think that it is a number of additional requirements. It really isn't, because once you have the export certificate and you've cleared with customs, what it is essentially saying is that you have done all that you have always been doing. The only difference now is that because you're going to the EU, a license is prepared, more than likely by the Forestry Commission, and then it's simply issued to you. And that license will specify about some basic information: what you're exporting, volumes, to whom. That's standard information. Maybe have a seal of the Forestry Commission so it can't be tampered with, that sort of thing. But essentially, that is what happens when you get to the point of exporting.
How can a VPA increase accountability and why it matters? To be accountable, governments, companies, and individuals must do what they have promised to do. They must take responsibility for their actions and be prepared to answer for the results. Accountability contributes to good forest governance. The purpose of the VPA Annex on the legality definition is to identify the national laws a voluntary partnership agreement VPA partner country will use to indicate legality of timber and describe the process for gathering evidence to monitor compliance with the law.
Regardless of what the source of the timber being exported is, the legality definition and regulatory framework specify what the legal requirements are for sending these products to the EU.
When you look at Annex 2, what you will see is all the different sources, possible sources of timber. So, for example, we have large concessions, we have small concessions, we have title land marine lands, we have mining areas, we may have agriculture areas, we may have some other private lands as well, where timber, all these are possible sources of timber. And so when you look at the legality definition, what you'll see is what we refer to as matrices or tables essentially. Now what those tables will say is, depending on the type of operator you are or the type of producer that you are. So let's say you are a large concession holder, you will then have a matrix that specifies, as a large concession holder, what are the requirements you have to meet in order for timber coming from your concession, for example, to be able to go to the EU. Similarly, if you are a title land marine village, then you simply have a table as well that will specify what, coming from that source, what are the requirements you'd have to meet to be able to send timber to the EU, or as I mentioned, any other part of the world. Because I think sometimes stakeholders think that FLEGT requires a lot more than other parts of the world do, and really the fact is, it is really one and the same in terms of the system. It's the same checks and balances. The only difference is the FLEGT license at the end of the process, really. Maybe I should add, for those of you who will, because these annexes are available online on our website, you may see the term FSO, or you may see the acronym FSO, and really the FSO is the acronym we've used, or the term we use, which is forest sector operator, and that term really is referring to that specific producer of the timber that is coming into the supply chain. So if you're a sawmiller, there's a matrix that deals with persons that are processing, or an exporter. That FSO then refers to you. So even when you look at the document, just for understanding purposes, when you look at the document, you see FSO, you're a large concession holder, yes, and then you see it refers to you as an FSO. That in that matrix, it is you that it is referring to as the person who is producing that timber or bringing it into the supply chain.
The legality definition is divided into several parts. Components related to environment, economic, and social. So under the environment component, there's something called the annual allowable cut, the AAC. So all forestry concession holders, based on your area size and the inventory of the trees, you will have an annual allowable cut, a certain amount of trees that you can cut annually. And once you fit within that requirement, and the GFC will check that, then that's a check. That's one of the checks. So the legality definition, there are several checks. There are about 20 different checks that you need to do before something is considered legal.
Each country has its different legality definition because it's based on your national legislation. So it wouldn't be looking at the legislation, but maybe the format that the LD is in, and then adjusting it to suit our legislation and our system. We have continuously adjusted, amended, and drafted to get as fair view and reflection of the law, and also to ensure that what we want is, when people look at the legality definition, you must be able to tell, okay, I want to get a large concession. This is what I need to do. This is what I need to do. This is what I need to comply with. So it's really drafted so that the person or the forest sector operator, as we have chosen to group everybody under the LD as, they should be able to look at it and see what they need to comply with, and if they're not complying, what it is that needs to be changed in order for them to have legal timber.
The items being packed into the container, several documents must be submitted for processing at our entry processing unit. And that is where the process begins. It begins with an exporter submitting documents from the Forestry Commission, such as the permits to export, the type of products that will be exported. And I'm sure you would have discussed the product scope. So basically, for those product scope, we will be looking to ensure that the EU FLEGT certificate is issued. after those products would have been verified, packed into the container, sealed, signed off by the Forestry Commission officer and the GRA export officer. What the customs officer will be looking for initially would be that process C72, that's customs declaration, or if they have, let's say, a prior to processing being issued for the exportation of any one of the items being exported, with the necessary documentation, which of course will include the permit from forestry for exportation. This does not include the EU FLEGT certificate. The EU FLEGT certificate will come after. Will come after the forestry officer and the GRA export officer would have verified that the product that is being exported to the EU country is one that is under licensing, and it's actually packed into the container, sealed, and then written off. At that point, the exporter will come back to forestry and get the certificate. So at the time of loading onto the vessel, the officer will definitely look for that certificate.
If buyers purchase timber from producers that comply with national laws, pay for the timber they fell, and act responsibly towards the local population and the environment, this will help reduce illegal logging.
The EU will also be playing an integral role in partnership with Guyana to ensure that all systems are indeed being adhered to.
This is a key feature of the European Union Forest Law Enforcement Governance of Trade. The onus is not just on the country. The country is expected to do their part, but there will be independent audits periodically. Again, we are still some way before the end of our ratification process. So we have not confirmed on if the independent audits will be done once per year, twice per year, every other year. But with that said, there will be independent audits being conducted. So they will pick up documents from the European Union, come to Guyana to verify that all that we have checked off and say, yes, this is in place, they can confirm. So they will go into the fields, they will go into NIS, they will come and check our records and see if our systems are in place. They will also, like one of the requirements would be, let's say an SFP, how did the person get the concession in the first place? And they need to see that it was advertised, they need to see the ranking of the allocation process and so forth. So there's an independent audit component of the EU FLEGT. So it's not just left on Guyana, but they will be coming to do independent audits to verify that our systems are as robust as we say they are.
It is important for stakeholders to remember that the FLEGT Action Plan and Voluntary Partnership Agreement will not make the process for exporting timber products to the EU burdensome.
What I want to say to any exporter out there is for them to embrace us, engage us. Even if you may not be an exporter, but you may be someone who's selling the product that requires a FLEGT license, engage us. Because when you go through the documents, they're documents that you're required to get and keep on hand for any other agency. It's just that now it's being enforced.
The EU FLEGT process is developed by Guyanese for Guyanese. So it really builds on what currently exists. It's not a matter that new rules and regulations are being introduced. There are many existing rules and regulations that operators need to comply with, but it's ad hoc. It's connected in several different ministries, agencies, or departments. What the EU FLEGT and the legality definition by extension tries to do is to bring everything together.
Because we're building on existing systems, stakeholders should, I don't want to say rest easy in that sense, but understand that they already have a very good foundation that they're standing on. So FLEGT isn't necessarily bringing new things. Yes, there'll be some minor changes, but the tax, for example, will remain. The permits will remain. Royalties, licenses. These are all things that have been part of the system, things that they have been accustomed to.
Be sure to join us again next time as we continue our journey towards improving transparency and accountability in the management of Guyana's forest resources.